Having surpassed 1,000 completed anime, it's time to review my old favorites and find out what holds up. I'm Sacrabolic, your envoy of hope, and this is Anime Favorite Search. Owarimonogatari is a 12-episode season containing, I think, about 4 arcs, which the first half of the season is dedicated almost exclusively to Araragi's relationship with a girl named Sodachi Oikura. And also, this is the arc that introduces Best Girl Ogi Oshino. This also, I will say that Owarimonogatari during the Sodachi arcs has the best theme, like my favorite Monogatari theme, Mathemagic, in it. Regardless, the second half of the season is dedicated to the Shinobu male arc, and really the first half of this is very heavily dedicated into further establishing what has been hinted on during season 2, which is the relationship between Koyomi Araragi and Ogi Oshino, while also using the character of Sodachi Oikura to further establish the characterization of young Araragi and help solidify in your mind the ideas that eventually became his character and how he became who he was in the main story going into something like Kizumonogatari. The second half, with the Shinobu male arc, as far as I can tell, has nothing to do with this concept at all. I mean, like, there's hints at it, there's little touches on it. You could make the argument that the Shinobu male arc tells us how Shinobu became who she was, since Shinobu is such a fundamental aspect of Araragi, and perhaps that is the angle that Owari gets into. I know that it definitely sets up something that happens later in Owarimonogatari, but as far as it goes, I would say that Owarimonogatari, the first half of this, is very much moving us into the endgame, very much establishing the fundamental cornerstones that are required to the end of the story, and then the other half sort of fills in the gap about what the fuck was Araragi and Shinobu during the Tsubasa Tiger arc. Regardless, starting off with Ogi Formula shows us introduction to Best Girl Ogi Oshino. Now, whether you're watching chronological, novel, or broadcast order, Ogi Oshino has been appearing for a while now, because a lot of Season 2 is actually framed as a conversation between Araragi and her, but this is the official introduction to her in the timeline, where she is introduced to Araragi, funnily enough, through Kanbaru, which does make sense because she's supposed to be Araragi's kohai, and so it would make sense, I suppose, that Ogi is brought to Araragi from Kanbaru, who would be in the same year as Ogi. Oh, even though I absolutely refuse to acknowledge that they're in the same class. They might actually be, but I don't know about that. Also, I recall an interaction between them in Hanamonogatari. Hopefully I remember to talk about that when I get there, which is, I actually think I probably have already talked about Hanamonogatari if you're watching this in broadcast order. Anyway, regardless, Ogi introduces herself as the niece of Oshino Meimei, hence the similar last names to both her and Shinobu. And she brings to attention Araragi the idea that one of the hallways appears to be larger than there should be, and so there might be a secret room, which leads them both into a room where they are locked into, where Araragi is forced to confront an event that occurred during his first year of school. This is the event where Araragi created his philosophy of not having friends, and it is really how Araragi became the sort of sourpuss, loner-type character he was in Kizumonogatari. In this event, we find out that there is a girl named Sodachi Oikura, who is an important character to the idea of this, but is also, I would argue, the main character of Owarimonogatari. Specifically of Part 1, not of Part 2. Anyway, the event is that there was a study group headed by Sodachi where everyone who participated in the study group scored 20 points higher on a math test than everyone who did not participate in this study group, with the exception of Araragi, who did not participate but scored a 100%. Araragi has said that after this event he never scored 100% on another math test, but it has been established that Araragi is skilled at math. The implication of this is that due to the events of this assembly, due to the events of this classroom court drama that occurs back in time in his first year, Araragi has been mentally handicapping himself and not necessarily trying his best, both in his relationships, which we already knew about, but also in his academic studies. Although the crux of this is solving the ritual of what happened in the class assembly, the emotional core of this is Araragi confronting these events from his past and sort of overcoming them, all while being guided by the sort of know-it-all smugness of Ogi Oshino. But, of course, it's not what Ogi knows that matters, it's what Araragi knows. And like Ogi, Araragi essentially knows the answer to this from the beginning. It's just he takes a while to sort of remember and sort of release his grasp on the emotions he has been repressing. This arc has a potential to fundamentally change Araragi's behavior as a character, and although I don't recall if that happens, I am going to be taking a look at seeing how much Araragi changes post-Ogi formula. Because despite being named after Ogi Oshino, and this is her introduction arc, this really is more of an Araragi arc. And with this being the introduction of Ogi Oshino, another question comes up, which is, how much does Ogi know? Obviously, I would argue that for the bulk of the story, the real central conflict is a sort of shadow game between Ogi Oshino and Izuku Gaien. And with that, we also have to wonder, why exactly did the classroom appear? Did it appear as a benefit to Araragi, as a buildup of emotional turmoil that's finally overflown, or was this an oddity created by Ogi? It is, I think, worth noting that Ogi was the one that brought it to his attention, but that could also just be the nature of Ogi bringing Araragi's flaws and issues to the forefront. So it's not clear, and like a lot of things with Ogi, you really could not trust a single fucking thing she says anyway. So it's really hard to tell in that regard. Another interesting thing is at the end of the arc, Sodachi Oikura reappears for the first time in essentially 3 years. We get the reason on why she reappears, but it does bring the question of how Ogi knew she would reappear. It's possible that Ogi does not know, and all of this and Ogi's behavior is brought on by the resolution of Araragi realizing that the real culprit would be leaving the school. And so that could funnel down into Ogi deciding to finally act on the information and causing all of that to boil over. So if anything, you know what? Actually, now that I'm vocalizing this, I guarantee you that was the trigger. I guarantee you the culprit leaving the school was what triggered Ogi to bring it to Araragi's attention. There, done. Holy shit, I figured that out again while recording this review. I know I've said this before, but Monogatari is genuinely the best written anime series I've ever seen. That's fucking crazy that actually made sense. And I guess what I would say is this is a, shockingly good arc. I don't know if I would say it's shocking. It's hard to say that Monogatari shocks me with how good it is at this point, but it is a surprisingly good arc despite being essentially a bottle episode where 2 characters are locked in a classroom. And I do love the visualization at one point where Ogi is, enwrapping Araragi's body like she's a fucking snake. Ogi Oshino is best girl. There is no fucking question. And we get an episode of best girl and best boy locked in a fucking classroom, solving a mystery case like a goddamn detective. It's a great fucking arc, and it's really interesting how we get to see the sort of formation of Araragi. And one could argue very easily, now that Ogi Oshino has appeared and the real major players are in the game, the development of Koyomi Araragi. Sodachi Riddle involves the reunion between Araragi and Sodachi Oikura, which is incredibly explosive and reveals that she still sorta hates him after all of these years. I say sort of, it's a huge blow up. She slaps Senjo Gahara after she stabs Araragi, and then Senjo Gahara punches her in the fucking face. So I guess saying she kinda hates him is a bit of an understatement. Regardless, she reveals that Araragi, it implies that Araragi owes everything he has to her. And so Araragi ends up trying to investigate what she could be referencing with the help of Ogi Oshino, Best Girl. Specifically referencing Araragi's middle school shoe locker, which reveals that he was tutored in math when he used to be bad at math by a girl in middle school whose name he never got in a sort of dilapidated house. This arc acts as a sort of foundational backbone for Araragi, where he mentions that this incident had a very strong impact on him and his sense of justice going forward, and was sort of foundational in the creation of who Araragi functions as a character, while also giving us tips about the very troubled home life of Sodachi Oikura. There's also some good hints with Ogi in this one, where at one point Araragi points out how easy he finds it talking to her and how he tells her things that he normally wouldn't tell people. And she also briefly makes a comment on how she has her memories from elementary and middle school don't exist, and it's like she was born recently. So there's a lot of little hints to the sort of mysterious angle for Ogi Oshino, as well as, the backstories of Araragi and Sodachi. This is a very build-up sort of episode, series of episodes arc, because it takes place in the middle of Owarimonogatari, so we haven't really gotten into the sort of conclusion of Sodachi's story. This is almost sort of the Tsubasa family arc of the Sodachi experience. Regardless, the arc itself is actually very interesting as we slowly unravel the mysteries and we learn more about our characters. And it is definitely some of the best parts of the Monogatari series. Worth noting, this is also when we start getting the Mathemagic opening, which is my favorite of the Monogatari opening. I don't think I've really talked about the openings before, but the Mathemagic is my all-time favorite. I absolutely love it, and so that's part of what I enjoy so much about Owarimonogatari. Regardless, the arc does sort of end with a hint from Hanakawa that it does seem like there's more to Sodachi's hatred of Araragi than just the implication that he may have abandoned her to abusive parents. So we've got more going on, but this is very much the midpoint of Sodachi's storylines, and so it's not the most conclusive, but it is a very interesting set of 2 episodes, showing that it's very quick and also very snappy. Sodachi Lost is an arc that starts with a little bit of a blurb, defining Ogi Oshino as Ogi Oshino and nothing more, but it then goes on to prompt you to describe in 20 words or less how foolish is Koyomi Araragi, but you must use Ogi Oshino at least once in the answer. And this is really the sort of opening blurb that seems nonsensical upon watching the series the first time, but going back for a rewatch really actually does sort of hit you. I mean, it's really just all right there and in your face, but you don't understand it the first time. And I think the opening to the Sodachi Lost arc, specifically the first 2 minutes that's just talking about this seemingly unrelated thing, it really does prove and show evidence to how much Monogatari really does get better on a rewatch. Regardless, Sodachi Lost involves Araragi basically finalizing the picture in his mind of why Oikura has such a fucking hate boner for him. And he ends up working with Hanakawa to essentially go to her house and go to Senjo Gahara's house to sort of smooth over their relationship after they had a fight. I believe the fight was actually in the last arc. I'm not going to lie. I waited 2 weeks before I recorded the audio for this review. Anyway, what ends up happening is Hanakawa basically gets a sort of bad feeling and ends up not going off with Senjo Gahara, specifically because Ogi Oshino ends up trying to go to speak to Oikura with Araragi rather than by himself. Further elaborate, Hanakawa develops a great mistrust for Ogi Oshino in this arc, and they get along like oil and water. They are constantly butting heads, and a good portion of this arc is dedicated to Ogi Oshino just shitting on Hanakawa the whole time. And I'm fucking here for it, all right? Hanakawa isn't a bad character because I really don't think anyone in Monogatari is a bad character. But as far as like the main girls go, she's definitely one of my least favorites. And Ogi Oshino, best girl. So if she wants to shit on Hanakawa all day, every day, I'm on fucking board for it. Especially because she's so fucking charismatic while she does it. Regardless, this brings us to the confrontation with Sodachi, where she is very self-aware of her own character flaws, and Araragi confronts her with the fact that he has remembered their past relationships and the sins that basically led to her hatred of him. And she acknowledges fully in this arc that, technically speaking, none of her problems are actually Araragi's fault, and he is basically blameless, but it is an issue where she needs to hate someone, she needs someone to blame, or it becomes no one's fault or her fault, and she doesn't feel mentally strong enough to deal with that. And Araragi, being Araragi, is like, that's fine, it's totally my fault, blame me all you fucking want. And this arc actually tries to resolve the point where Oikura, who we find out is living by herself after the disappearance of her mother, is essentially, they're trying to bring her back to school, Hanakawa and Araragi, because they're the class presidents, and also because they're Hanakawa and Araragi. And so they're trying to bring her back to school, and after actually semi-smoothing out the relationship between her and Araragi, she actually issues a challenge that if Araragi can find her mom, she will come back to school. She will agree to come back to school, and she will personally apologize for her fight with Senjo Gahara. And so where this essentially goes is, I think there's a little bit of an interplay between Ogi and between Araragi in this one, where Ogi, overhearing and of course coming into the information of the details surrounding Oikura's mom's disappearance, immediately figures out the answer, to the point where she starts taunting Hanakawa about how she didn't figure it out and is like, you better beg my forgiveness. And Hanakawa is like, give me 10 seconds, runs off, washes the black dye out of her hair, comes back, full tiger stripes, immediately figures out the answer in 10 seconds. And Araragi's like, I don't know what's fucking happening, but apparently you two figured it out. Hanakawa goes to tell him the solution, and Ogi's like, no, you make him figure it out himself. And so they give him a bunch of hints until he comes to the horrifying conclusion. And I actually think that Ogi's absolute hatred of Hanakawa in this arc, and I think that Ogi's immediate figuring out of what happened to Oikura's mom is actually a really interesting aspect of her character and her character's true nature. At this point, we've already gotten strong suspicions that Ogi Oshino is not a regular girl. At this point, there's a strong implication that Ogi Oshino is some sort of oddity. The nature of the oddity is not clear at this point, but I will say that I do find it interesting the friction she has with Hanakawa. And I almost want the story to explore that more, and I feel like it kind of doesn't. Regardless, this does lead us to Hanakawa, I believe, at the end of the arc, mentioning that she's planning to go on an exploratory trip and essentially leave the main cast while she goes to travel around the world towards the end, where she will remain gone for the remainder of the series, basically. Regardless, as with every arc that Ogi features prominently on, this is the one where I really wish we actually got more interactions between her and Hanakawa, but I feel like this is sort of a slap-in-the-face wake-up call to Hanakawa to get her shit together, while also is sort of showing the development of Araragi under the instructions of Ogi Oshino. I'm talking a lot about Ogi because she's best girl, but I do want to say that the whole situation with Oikura and her mom and her situation and her relationship with Araragi, Hanakawa, Senjo Gahara, I think that's all wonderfully done, and I do think that Sodachi arc is a very strong, one of the best arcs in the entire series. Shinobu Mail is an arc where I don't know where the name comes from because I don't think anyone gets mail at any point in the entire arc, unless the mail is a reference to vampire ashes, which I guess is possible, but it really does feel like a title that just sort of got made up because the arc needed a title. Regardless, Shinobu's first minion that she ended up creating 400 years ago that we got a bit more information on in a previous arc, which was the Shinobu Time arc, if I recall correctly, ended up reforming his body. Turns out he wasn't actually dead. He was just a bunch of bad ashes, which is what has sort of caused the rise of apparitions in the city, because he has the same basic abilities as Shinobu did back when she was Kiss Shot Acerola Orion Heart Underblade. And so because of that, he ends up drawing oddities and sort of like negative energy to him. So when he drifts into town, he goes to the original Shirohebe shrine. They draw even more energy to the town. And that's basically what caused all of the bad juju and all of the oddities that strike through the town. That's also why there was so much energy back in time for them to do the time travel with. But when they end up not doing the time travel during the Maoi Jingshi arc, I guess they end up not consuming the bad juju energy. So that ends up happening. Points is, he ends up reforming, and he basically just wants to have a conversation with Shinobu, and Shinobu is not about that shit. And so this is the mission, basically, that Araragi agreed to go on while bringing Kambaru with him when he spoke to Guy and Izuko back in the previous arc, back during Shinobu time, where essentially she wants the two of them to stop the original apparition killer, Shinobu's first minion. So they're supposed to team up and take him down, because unfortunately, the mission to prevent his reformation ended up not going according to plan. To be honest, the character of the first apparition killer isn't particularly interesting, and I really don't have a whole lot to say about him. I do think that it's interesting that one of the Kizumonogatari vampire hunters returns. Namely, Episode, the teleporting cross guy was he the one that was half vampire? He might have been the half vampire one. I don't know. Don't quote me on that. Anyway, turns out he's also working for Izuko. And so basically Izuko gets this group together to just fucking stab the shit out of this vampire before he ends up back at full power. Makes sense in context. What I think this arc probably has more to do with is I think there's a lot of sort of in-character philosophies at play here, including a stellar moment where Kambaru argues with Shinobu, one of the few times they interact throughout the entire series. And Kambaru really does pull her weight here with her limited screen time, sort of telling Shinobu that she owes it to the apparition killer to basically resolve the situation with him. No matter how it turns out, she's got to do it. And interestingly, there's also a conversation here that has stuck with my head for years, even after watching this, which is a conversation where Araragi has decided that he is got to take out the apparition killer himself. That's the job that he has taken upon himself. And he has a call with Hitagi Senjo Gahara, who tells him that there are no irreplaceable people in the world. There's no one that can't be replaced, but you can try to be irreplaceable to people. It makes more sense when she says it. Anyway, the point is that this philosophy she gives him, this speech she gives him, sort of ends up empowering him in that he is the one that the women in his life have chosen to be around. Like, if no one is irreplaceable, then he's not there because he's some special chosen one, which contrasts exactly with what the apparition killer says, which is that he is a special chosen one. Araragi is there because the people around him have chosen that. And that solidifies his resolve against the apparition killer. And that speech between those two is honestly one of the bits of philosophy from the Monogatari series that has probably stuck with me the hardest ever since watching it. And I wouldn't necessarily say it's an empowering, good feeling sort of a philosophy, but it's a good one to subscribe to. It's a good one to understand and internalize about the importance of doing your best, which also, now that I'm speaking, oh god, this is going to be such a long review. Now that I'm speaking about this, reminds me of when Araragi, before asking Senjo Gahara, asked Kambaru for advice about the duel, and she said DIY, which she then said means do your best, which do your best also goes along with the advice that Senjo Gahara would end up doing. But of course, Araragi also interpreted it as DIY, do it yourself, which is why he ends up fighting the first apparition hunter. Regardless, it is a beautiful bit of tie-in with that and how all of the characters manage to like thread their philosophies together. There's also another important bit about this arc, which is that this entire thing is framed as a conversation between Araragi and Ogi in the future. I wrote somewhere down in my step-by-step guide on Mal when this conversation takes place. I know it's the day of Araragi's exams. Apparently, I cared enough to look it up. It's actually episode 2 of Owarimonogatari second season when he goes on the date with Senjo Gahara. Anyway, the conversation is basically Araragi telling Ogi about these events, and through this, we get a bit of more information about the impending sort of mental duel between Ogi and Izuko. Even more than that, we also see bits of this arc, because this arc takes simultaneously at the same time as the Tsubasa Tiger arc. We see cuts between this and sort of influences going on from the Tsubasa Tiger arc, and we see the sheer depths of manipulation and intel that Guy and Izuko possesses, and that this whole scenario is sort of set up. It's not clear whether this is set up so that she wants to just have like Episode and herself and everyone just beat the shit out of the vampire so that they can get a hold of his armor, or if this is set up to sort of strengthen Araragi's resolve so that he would end up fighting the vampire even harder. It's not clear. It's sort of hard to get a read on Izuko, but the point is it ended up going exactly how she planned it to do, which is that the apparition killer is dead and she achieves his armor, which is a bit of information acquired at the end during the framing device by Ogi, who points out that if she gets a hold of the armor, she can use that to make another Kokoro Watari, which is the apparition sword that just like, it almost one-shots every single apparition. Like, basically every time it hits an apparition, they almost immediately hit the ground. It is basically a 2-shot kill sword in every scenario. Like, every time we've seen it hit an apparition, it just fucking flops to the fucking floor and gets ready to get finished off. Whether it gets finished or not is very rare. I don't know if the sword has ever actually finished an apparition off. Actually, I think it hits the tiger. But it definitely can. So this obviously does a lot of things. First off, I feel like this really solidifies Shinobu as a character. As far as I recall, there are no other major Shinobu arcs. I believe there might be a Koyomi Monogatari one with the donuts, but there's no other major Shinobu arcs, at least until Often Monster season. So this basically gets us to where Shinobu goes, where she like truly and completely chooses Araragi. And this, I think, is probably where their relationship is, at this point, the most solidified throughout the story. If anything, I would almost say that this puts a bow on where we're going with them for a good sizable amount of time. From what I understand, there's some developments in the later light novels, but I don't even think there's anime about that right now. So it does not matter at the time. And obviously, we have the impactful philosophy I've already discussed throughout this. And we have such good foreshadowing for both the events of later arcs and the mental duel between Izuko and Ogi, who, even though they mostly just appear sporadically throughout the arc, really reinforces why those two are my absolute favorite characters in this entire series. Twitch and Discord in the description. I've been Sacrobolic, your Envoy of Hope. Bye-bye!